The topic of lecture 8 is the verbal categories of voice and mood. The first part of the lecture is devoted to the discussion of the category of voice. Most transitive verbs can occur in two voices, active and passive. The active form of the verb shows that the action described by the verb is performed by the subject of the sentence, while the passive form indicates that the action is performed upon the subject. For instance, the sentence, "The butler murdered the detective," is given in the active voice, while "the detective was murdered by the butler" is already in the passive voice. The active is the most common unmarked voice, whereas the passive is a marked member of the voiced opposition, since it is formed with the help of the auxiliary be plus the past participle of the main verb. The passive verb forms are less common and are used for special discourse functions. Compared to active voice, passive voice reduces the importance of the agent, that's the doer of the action, and allows the receiver of the action to become the subject of the sentence. For instance, "The house has been repaired and furnished." However, passive verb phrases can also be formed with the auxiliary get, called the get passives. For instance, get cold, get arrested, get dressed, get run over, etc. Get passives are usually used in conversation and in informal English. For instance, it's about the people who got left behind in Vietnam. Changing a sentence from active to passive voice has the following results. First, the subject, if retained, becomes the object in the passive, and vice versa. The object of the active construction becomes the subject in the passive. For instance, "Hurricane demolished more than 500,000 homes" is in the active voice, and the subject, hurricane, becomes the object in the passive voice, while the object of the active voice becomes the subject in the passive voice. 500,000 homes were demolished by hurricane. Second, the preposition by is inserted before the agent. For instance, "The kitchen has been whitewashed by Nick." Third, if the active verb is ditransitive, the indirect object may also become the subject of the passive sentence. For instance, "The company gave Mariko permission to go to Osaka." And in the passive voice, Mariko, which was the indirect object in the active voice, becomes the subject of the passive construction. Mariko was given permission by the company to go to Osaka. There are short and long passives. In short passives, also called agentless passives, the agent is not specified, while long passives contain a by-phrase which specifies the agent of the action. For instance, "The children were sent to the camp" is short passive because it has no agent, while "The children were sent to the camp by their uncle" is the long passive because there figures an agent of the action, the uncle. According to the corpus-based grammar data, short passives are about 6 times as frequent as long passives. Sidney Greenbaum and Randall Kirk, the famous British grammarians, indicate that speakers and writers use agentless, that is short passives, for the following reasons. First, when they do not know the identity of the agent of the action. For instance, many lifeboats were launched from the Titanic only partly filled. Second, when they want to avoid identifying the agent in order not to assign or accept responsibility. For instance, my letter has not been answered yet, or a mistake has been made in calculating your change. Third, when they feel that there is no reason to mention the agent because the identification is unimportant or obvious from the context. For instance, he was arrested and sent to prison for stealing a car. Nowadays, cancer can be cured if it is detected early enough. And finally, in scientific and technical writing, authors often use the short passives to avoid the constant repetition of the first-person subject, I or we, to put the emphasis on processes and experimental procedures. This use of the passive helps to give the writing the objective tone which the authors wish to convey. For instance, blood test was taken and examined. Long passives are used for the following purposes: to put emphasis on the agent of the action, to avoid what would otherwise be a long active subject, and to retain the same subject in later parts of the sentence. The following sentence exemplifies a combination of all three reasons for using the long passives. I'll read this sentence. As a cat moves, it is kept informed of its movements not only by its eyes, but also by messages from its pets and elsewhere in its skin, its organs of balance, and its sense organs of joints and muscles. The frequency of both forms of the passive varies greatly across registers. Passive voice verbs are most common in expository registers where agents are often unknown or unimportant. In academic press, passives account for about 25% of all finite verbs. Passives are also common in news, where they often report negative events that happened to someone, as in the following text given below. I'll read this text. School principal killed in class. A 49-year-old principal was found dead in a pool of blood Wednesday morning in a classroom at the church-run school she ran. Police said the body of Susie York was found around 11 a.m. A motive and cause of death were not immediately released. Police would not confirm reports that York had been stabbed. Most passive voice verbs are easy to identify. However, sometimes words look like passive verbs but are actually predicative adjectives describing a state or quality. For example, we are delighted with the result, or I thought I ought to be excited. These participial adjectives function as predicatives. They are usually gradable and can be modified by the adverbs of degree such as very, rather, and quite. Some participial forms, like broken and frozen, can occur in both passives and predicative adjectives. In some contexts, they are clearly functioning as passive verbs describing an action with an agent, For instance, the silence was broken by the village crier. However, in other sentences, the same word form may express a state and behave like a qualifying adjective. For instance, the wire is always broken in this place. In English verb phrases, the passive can combine with perfect and progressive aspects. In actual use, though, the perfect passive is only moderately common, while the progressive passive is rare. The perfect passive with present perfect tense is preferred in academic prose and news, while the past perfect passive is moderately common in fiction. Thus, we have analyzed the category of voice of the verb, focusing on the functional semantic peculiarities of its active and passive forms. The second part of the lecture is devoted to the category of mood. The category of mood is a morphological expression of modality. That is, it marks the modality of reality or unreality of an action or state as viewed by the speaker. Grammarians differentiate three moods in modern English: the indicative mood, the imperative mood, and the subjunctive mood. The indicative mood presents an action as a real fact that happened in the past, is happening now, or will happen in future. That's why it's called a real mood or a fact mood. The indicative mood is rich in forms reflecting all grammatical categories of the finite verb. That is, the categories of person and number, tense, aspect, and voice. For instance, Nick speaks French and English fluently, but I speak only German. The imperative mood actually does not give any information as to the reality of an action described by the verb. That's why some linguists do not consider the imperative form to be a mood form, though it is traditionally included in the mood system on the ground that it represents a hypothetic action. An imperative typically urges the addressee to do or not to do something. It is used to give orders or requests and expects some action from the addressee. Given this limited function, most imperative clauses are characterized by the lack of a subject in the surface structure, by the use of the bare infinitive of the verb, that's infinitive without the particle to, and by the absence of modals as well as the tense and aspect markers. For instance, get off the table. Pass me the salt, please. Don't forget to send a wire to me. A special type of imperative referring to the first and third person, both singular and plural, is formed according to the formula, let somebody do or not do something. For instance, let's take a taxi. Well, let him try this. Let's see what happens. Although most imperative sentences are very simple, we need to take into consideration some variations that occur. Optionally, the addressee of an imperative sentence can be identified either by a subject represented by the pronoun you or a vocative address term. For instance, in this sentence, you go home and have a rest, you is a subject expressed by a second person pronoun indicating the addressee of the discourse. Whereas in the sentence, and take those things away, N is a vocative term represented by proper name. It should be noted that When the subject is expressed by the pronoun you, it precedes the main verb and is not separated from it by punctuation or intonation break. Different from it, the vocative, for instance, N, is more mobile and can be positioned at the beginning, middle, and at the end of the sentence. Imperative clauses can also elaborate it by addition of the question text, discourse markers like please, and adverbs like just. For instance, pick your plate up from down there, will you? Pass me this drink, please. Just dump it at the door there. The question tag, will you, does little to soften the command. The word please has a softening effect, but in some way it has a minimal politeness strategy. The adverb just makes the imperative seem less demanding and easier to comply with. It is clear from these and other examples that an imperative can express a range of direct speech acts, varying from commands to offers and invitations, depending on the situation and the kind of demand made on the addressee. Imperatives are frequently used in conversation because speakers often try to direct the activity of listeners. Similarly, fiction texts use imperatives in dialogue passages. It is more surprising that the written informative registers need imperatives. In fact, imperatives are more frequent than questions in news, academic writings, advertisements, and instructions, presumably because writers can use them to manipulate the reaction and behavior of the reader. The third type of mood is the subjunctive mood, which presents an action as unreal or hypothetical. There are two forms of the subjunctive. They are traditionally called the present and the past subjunctive, although the distinction relates more to mood than to tense. The form of present subjunctive coincides with the infinitive of the verb. Accordingly, the subjunctive form be is a distinct form of its indicative forms am, is, and are. For instance, be it as you wish. For other verbs, present subjunctive is distinctive only in the third person singular, as it does not take the inflection as. Yes. Present subjunctive is used in certain set expressions, such as God bless you, long live the king, God save the king, and so on. Negation of the present subjunctive does not require an operator, that is, the auxiliary do. For instance, I insist that the council not consider its decision. The past subjunctive is identical in form with the simple past of the verb. For instance, if I had time, I would go and see him. If he remembered my phone number, he would call me. The exception is the verb be, which occurs in the past subjunctive as were, with all the persons both in singular and plural. Because of this, the past subjunctive is sometimes referred to as were subjunctive. The past subjunctive is hypothetical in meaning. It is used mostly in conditional clauses and in object-subordinate clauses after the lexemes like wish and suppose. For instance, if I were a rich man, I would travel in Africa. If I were you, I would tell him everything. I wish he came to see me off. I wish the journey were over. Just suppose everyone were to act like you. There are two analytical forms of the subjunctive mood. The first is the form which is homonymous with the past perfect and is used in object, subordinate, and conditional clauses of the third type, also called unreal forever. It expresses a regrettable situation or event which was not fulfilled, or conversely, was fulfilled in the past. For instance, I wish he had come to my birthday party. He wished he had not stolen the money. If I had lent him money, he would not have committed a larceny. The second analytical form of the subjunctive mood is the form with the mood auxiliaries should or would plus the indefinite or perfect infinitive of the main verb. For instance, if I had had some money with me, I would have bought that beautiful dress. If I were you, I would go to the concert with him. The owner of the firm demanded that the manager should resign. Thus, we have discussed the verbal categories of voice and mood, focusing on their structural and functional semantic peculiarities, both in conversation and written text. That's all for this lecture. Thank you.